Welcome to the Skeptic Zone, the podcast from Australia for science and reason.
I won't put that on the podcast, that's all right. So, you can sneak peek behind the scenes of a podcast. You can all hear me okay? All right. Hello and welcome to the Skeptic Zone podcast, episode number 589 for the 27th of January 2020. This week coming to you live from Portland, Oregon. That's the Sasquatch, right? You brought one in. It's wonderful to be here. I'm about to give a talk about mystical energies and strange things like that. But coming up on this week's show, lots more from Maynard, more interviews from Skepticon, and we have the hot tub of truth. Now, yesterday at Brian Dunning's house, in his hot tub, we had a group of scientists and thinkers and some wine, and we recorded a session of science and philosophy in the hot tub. That's coming up on this week's show. And you all sound amazed out there. You all want to come next time? Yeah. And as a special, I don't often do this, the show this week will be in stereo. So if you listen through the headphones, it will be like you're in the hot tub with us. And that's worth listening for. So all that coming up on this week's show, but for now it's time for me to get on with my talk. And while I do that, I hope you enjoy the Skeptic Zone.
Join us now for Drinking Skeptically in the Think Tank.
There are stranger things to do than to sit in a hot tub in the state of Oregon with somebody with a thermal camera running around. It's night time. It's not quite freezing, is it? Brian Dunning from Skeptoid.com.
No, it is not. It is extraordinarily warm tonight. We lost most of our snow today, which I was very disappointed about.
Me too. To be honest, me too. I'm in a hot tub, folks. We're doing Skeptics in the Tub, or, as Maynard likes to call it, the hot tub of truth. Brian has gathered some a group of interesting people to join us in our hot tub of truth tonight. And one of the most interesting things is the light is variant here, so I'm struggling to read everything. We have Jean-Marc. Welcome, Jean-Marc.
Thank you.
And who is a neuroscientist.
Yes.
We also are very lucky to have Dr. Erika Anderson. Hello.
Hello.
And you work in local hospitals here.
I do.
All right. We also have Professor Wendi Wampler. Wendi? Mm-hmm. Oh, you're over there. There you are.
Hi.
Right on the other side. A physics professor.
It's a really big pool.
Yeah. It's a big pool. Who's on the other side?
Wendy was my daughter Erika's physics professor, so
All right.
I'm super happy to have her.
And local skeptic Susan Picard. Hello.
Hello.
Well, now we're all shifting our positions here because we were making jokes about Archimedes just a little while ago. But anyway, everybody, cheers and welcome to the hot tub of truth.
Cheers.
It's not quite the same with plastic glasses, Brian. When we
No.
Whoa! Oh my gosh.
All right. Now, this is sort of like the think tank, and long-term listeners to the Skeptic Zone podcast remember the think tank, where we all get together at the club at the end of the street, have a few beers, have some dinner, and chat about skeptical issues of the day. But a listener to the show has inspired tonight's series of questions and thoughts. And the first one is, I'll put to everybody here, is a very interesting question. Can science save the planet / humanity? Should we leave it up to science to save our problems, maybe the environment, things like that? Wendi, why don't you kick off with that thought?
I have a follow-up question. Are you saying, like, in an ideal world? Or in the reality we're in?
Well, are we? But yeah, probably in reality, huh?
I mean, yeah, I think they're two different questions. Is science capable with the tools it has to solve the big problems? Yeah. Is society open-minded enough to, and educated enough to know what to do with that information to then further, inform policy and funding and those sorts of things? I mean, that's, I think, in my head, I don't know the answer to that. I'm hopeful.
Do you think, and I'll put it up to everybody, do you think that there are some people out there who say, don't worry, science will solve the problems eventually, don't worry if we do this, that or the other?
I think
Absolutely.
it's not enough. I think it's more complicated than that. It's like Wendi said, I think we need to have, as a society, we need to have the desire to save ourselves from ourselves. But if we have that desire at a society level, then yes, I think science can do it, absolutely.
What should we do in the meantime? I mean, we can't just wait.
No, we can't wait. We need to educate people,
There needs to be some
especially young people.
psychosocial changes within our culture. There's a very fixed mindset about it'll be solved. I'm not part of it. It's okay. Like people,
Like
Not
out
my
of sight, out
problem.
of mind
out of
thing.
sight, out of mind. Absolutely.
Or like a scale issue, like, it's just me, so I can't solve it.
Exactly. It's just me.
cares?
Yeah.
But that's a good point.
I feel that economic theory has a big role to play there because economists can figure out what will work and what kinds of things will force the changes that we need. The interesting thing that leads into, though, is, okay, now you've got to have some sort of a totalitarian government who will just take the economists' policies and force them into law and make that be the law of the land. And then the next administration is going to come along and do who knows what with that same totalitarian power. So I mean, it's one of these situations where there's just no perfect solution.
Yeah. Well, I suppose the question is thinking of the globally. I mean, with the way the planet's going at the moment. And I guess the answer is no. We can't sit back and just think, oh, science will fix it. It'll be all right. It doesn't matter. We all have to do what we can, regardless. But where science could be said to be fixing things more and more is in your field, Erika, which is medicine. And even when I think back over the last 10, 20 years, and you'd know better than I, of course, I think the advancements in medical science have been astounding.
Oh, definitely,
Yeah.
definitely. It's progressed immensely, But to save the planet, do you trust humanity?
Oh, that's a good question.
It's not just a thing of science. How much influence do scientists really have over people and what's happening? Is it more a question of politics? Does politics have more influence? Like in the history, you always see, Renaissance, like an episode of science, and then like Dark Ages, right? So when science does not have very much influence over people. So,
What is that noise?
that's a compressor, Brian.
Yeah, it's a compressor for sure.
That's science, Brian.
Thank you.
Well, yeah, of course. Science, as long as science has been science, poor Brian, has been at the whim of politics and politicians to an extent, hasn't it?
Yeah, unfortunately.
Yeah, unfortunately. I know in my own country of Australia for many years, I'm not sure what the situation now is, we didn't have a minister for science for some reason. And everyone thought that was a bit crazy.
Wow.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Do we have a minister for science?
Well, you wouldn't have a minister.
Well, what happened with that? I mean, we have
I don't even know.
the President's
honestly.
Council.
even know.
What was it called exactly?
It's a science advisor, I think.
Yeah,
Or science and
and-
technology advisor, something
And
like that.
I think early on in the administration, pretty much everyone with any science background got thrown out of that department.
Yeah.
And I'm not even sure if there is a.
What would you call it?
It's been so long, I don't even remember what the position is called. But there's colloquially we call it the President's Science Advisor. But he's got an actual title, and it's like the
see.
chairman of the committee on
Yeah.
science and technology or something.
Well, we don't stray into politics much on the Skeptic Zone, but in this case it's appropriate, I think. I wonder how far a scientific advisor would get in the current White House.
No, not at all.
Not very far.
Not very
Not
far.
very far at all. Absolutely not.
Well, let me ask a question. Would it help if in elementary school, middle high school, if kids were taught critical thinking skills?
Oh, yeah,
and not just like what are the Socratic questions, but actual real world.
Yeah.
How do we analyze Gwyneth Paltrow's goop? And how do we know what's actually real? That kind of.
I have a bit to say about that because when I studied in grad school, I was in the physics department. I did astrophysics, but I studied brains and how they wire to learn physics. And one of my research questions was, how do students' belief in solving physics problems, like what they're supposed to do, affect like how successful they are in a physics class? And what we found through lots of studies were that students come in very authoritarian thinking. Like, my job isn't to be a critical thinker, it's to memorize something somebody else has told me and spit it back out.
Yep.
And what we found is those students will not be successful as science, engineering, math, technology students. So it's been like kind of the push of at least my class to kind of get them while we still can in college, but the idea is it should not be happening in college. These sorts of higher level thoughts should be happening way sooner. And they're just kind of not, and so everybody's falling into that authoritarian, just I'll trust what you say and I don't need to even look into it further to feel like I understand it. Like, I feel okay with somebody telling me, and my assessment of that is, then I understand it. I don't need to go further.
Yeah.
And I think that gets at a root of like so many problems in education, but in politics and
So that's
epistemological
I
beliefs.
think that's a really good point. So I don't know how, probably all of these people in this hot tub, in school, it was way easier for me to memorize something that was logical, that I could kind of logically see my way through, than just to memorize, right? So I don't know, is it somehow like a predisposition of certain people to be able to be critical thinkers and other people not so much? Can it be taught?
It's
Can it be learned?
fosterable. It can be learned. That's what I do
can
in my
be
class.
learned. I think so.
In the years, I see it happen. I have data for my thesis that shows that if you build it right and you emphasize it appropriately and you really kind of make sure it across every point in that class, for instance, that they're being challenged to be critical and that them memorizing fails, like you set them up over and over to fail. It's gleefully fun. Just be like, ha, you failed again. You need to think. But it works. But it takes time, effort, and training. And that's kind of what's tricky as a teacher is, I got lucky to get that training early on, and a lot of people haven't. And so when these students don't get that training, they statistically really struggle junior year in any sort of STEM field and tend to leave. And then we are in the same place we are, people who don't know how to critically think.
I'm interested because I think that one of the aspects of critical thinking I like is it's so interesting, because the topics in my field of skepticism I get to cover are the really interesting things, like, are there ghosts and UFOs and monsters, and how do people bend spoons, and what is this pseudoscience? And that's what really helped me become a critical thinker, was the sheer curiosity. And that stirred something in me, it's the interest, the passion, I think.
Oh, no, absolutely. I just wanted to say, with just talking about a little bit about the education system, and then going back to the original question of how do you think science could save us, some of the issues that we're having with the environment and climate change, I think, again, going back to a cultural, socio-psycho state where the whole world is kind of in, a lot of it has to do with the education of how we aren't trained to be critical thinkers, and we're just fed a bunch of information. So I know from personally speaking, I went to Catholic school for 8 years, and I learned absolutely nothing. I had to memorize things that I had questions about, and I was slow at memorizing, and it just never taught me how to think critically. I just authoritarian, just do what everyone told me. And I think that a lot of our issues can kind of stem from the educational systems, not only in the US, but abroad, where they teach to one mindset or one brain type. And there's this huge bell curve and variables of, well, you're a neuroscientist, correct?
Yep.
That people learn differently. And there's so many different ways of learning.
Absolutely.
But yet most schools are like, here, take this information, regurgitate it out. And I think that if we, from the start, learned how to be critical and to think through some of these problems, we wouldn't have some of these issues in our own society if we were educated properly.
Yeah, and that can come down to a particularly good teacher, can't it?
Yes.
Inspiring teacher who's
Like
interested in
Wendi.
things.
Let's turn the heat up in here anyways.
All right, so
It's Lisa Dunning.
our
Yay!
daughter is is at a university here in Oregon, and she's studying physics. And one of the things that she got, I guess, hooked up with, that's not the right word, hooked?
Hooked on?
Hooked on, not hooked.
I don't know what you're gonna say.
What are you going to say?
She got messed up with is that they gave the problem and said, now figure it out and use whatever physics you need to figure the problem out. So like trying to teach the critical thinking, like, oh, I have to pull from here and here and here, and she struggled because in high school she regurgitated exactly what was taught, and now she's like,
critical thinking skills.
oh my gosh, what do I do? And so she went to office hours and she just kept persevering, and the teacher's like, I have to kind of reprogram your brain a little bit. She's getting it now, but it's been a huge learning curve. So I think like we have to back up even further into middle school. Okay, elementary, all right, it's basic.
Elementary, way back now to kindergarten.
But I'd say middle school is when they start giving you, well, here, memorize this.
Yeah.
And then high school is like, here, memorize this, this, and this. And then, oh, by the way, here's the real world. And everyone goes, I can't do it.
But it's rote memorization in kindergarten as well. These are letters, A, B, C, repeat after me.
Don't know when the brain exactly is ready to start doing critical thinking. I think elementary might be a little early.
Exactly, variable, right?
Yeah, there was a lot
Some
of
kids aren't
differences.
ready.
Yeah, some kids are ready very early on, and others not until they become adults.
Of course, yes.
So
I see that transition as
and
adults.
there are still some people actually later in life they don't like critical thinking. Even if you tell them all the benefit they can get from thinking critically, they would rather sit down and have somebody tell them, okay, today you're going to wear this shirt and you're going to button it up all the way, and you're allowed to pull the sleeves or not. They want everything be laid out for them. Thinking critically it's an effort. So people have to realize the benefit they can get from it, and then they will be ready to put on the effort that it takes.
It is.
It's an effort, but it also feels good, right, guys? I mean,
Yes.
Not at first.
it has to release some kind of endorphins because it feels
Well, to
great.
people like all of us in this think tank and water tank, actually, it does feel good. But I know some people who actually feel good with just the opposite, who let the thinking done by others,
Right,
and
absolutely.
they sit back and that's it.
Well, what's scary is I have engineering majors who think, well, just tell me. And I'm like, that's your job, is to solve very difficult problems. I have to tell them, literally, and it's like they've never thought about it. Like, nobody pays you the big bucks to solve problems that are Googleable. That's not your job.
That's interesting.
That's just not your job. Your job is to take things that nobody knows how to solve and critically think and apply your knowledge and construct some new, unique answer that you can't just get from somebody else. And some of them, it's like the first time they ever thought about that. And it's interesting because they'll fight me on it for a full year of physics. And I'm like, that's the antithesis of engineering. it's not thinking. I just can't. It's the strangest thing. So it's almost like they don't even know that that's a required part of these fields or of building expertise or of any, I don't know. It kind of blows my mind still. So I'm usually that jerk who has to just rail at them for a while, for like a whole year. And I do.
It comes down to there are some people who are afraid of uncertainty, and science. Science likes uncertainty and asking more questions, and all that. It's basically why we are curious about everything.
Yeah.
Because we like uncertainty. But some people don't like uncertainty. They want things to be set in stone forever, and they never have to question it. So I think what we're up against is really to foster the desire among people to become critical thinkers, and I think, like Brian said earlier, it has to start with kids, because they are much more malleable than adults.
And many times they're simply wonderfully more curious.
Yes.
What's that? How does that work? What's that?
Yeah.
Yes.
So there are curriculum out there based on, like, particularly K through 5, really just inquiry based, where they're just given a context to study, and then they can each pick their jobs within that study.
Wow.
So, like, there's a
been like that
forest.
all along.
It's really cool. There's like
Yeah.
a forest behind your school, and you're going to map the forest out, figure out what all the plants are, categorize them, and document that. So some students like the documentation, like they like to be the person documenting it. Some students like to be the people investigating. And what happens is they pretty naturally engage themselves in science. The problem is that is really, in an infrastructure way, extremely difficult to do. It's hard to train teachers to do it. It's hard to fit within our BS. That's as much as all class, I promise. It's hard to
That's
fit
all right. That's all right.
inside the constraints. Yeah,
Bleep. Sorry. Okay, guys.
but it's really hard to fit in within the constraints of what these teachers are forced to do in terms of teaching the tests and the standardized testing, all that stuff. So there are really great curriculum out there. It's just like not right. How do you get it distilled into the entire population of teachers and the policies to change in terms of what they have to do? And that's
it's like a brain. You
That's
got to
the challenge.
reprogram the
yeah,
whole
it really
system.
is. We've got good ideas.
Yeah,
It's
you
just
got to
how do you
reprogram the whole society.
change
Ooh,
everybody's
that's getting heavy.
No, it
Yeah,
is.
no,
It kind of correlates with neuroscience. It's like you get to a certain age and you have neurons that are like firing up in the brain that have been firing up for a really long time, and to change that pattern of behavior, same thing with society.
It's
You
harder
gotta
and
switch
harder, but it can be
gears.
done.
It
you
can
know,
be
the
done.
brain
Absolutely.
is-
There's
The brain
plasticity.
is much more plastic
Right.
than we used
Society
to think.
is also plastic, but we're not exercising that
Right.
at all to change some of these things.
Brian knows a lot about this because he's got very old neurons, I must say.
Yes, you're older than mine.
Yes, so mine are older than yours. Now, before we move on to the next listener question, Wendi, when you arrived this evening and said hello, we all admired your wonderful dress, which had telescopes and everything.
the SETI Allen telescope array on the bottom of my dress.
And we all thought it was just
Don't
fantastic.
hear that very often.
So
Unfortunately.
Never.
So,
Not till tonight.
and this is a completely free plug for that website. If people would like to have a look and see some of the wonderful things that you were wearing tonight, where should they go?
It's the best nerdy clothing website I've found. It's svahausa.com.
All right.
If it's a word, it's Svaha. But I don't know if it's an acronym or not. So, but it's great. It's all kind of nerdy clothing and jewelry and dresses with pockets. Oh,
There you go.
pockets.
And you see, you don't visit it too often because you're.
I will buy something every time I go. Like 5 or 6 of their items. Oh yeah, scarves and cardigans and shirts.
We love that.
I got my girlfriend some necklace that with a little dopamine molecule.
That's perfect. They have stuff
Caffeine
like that.
molecule.
Yeah, they have lots of that.
Even the THC molecule.
You should get her like an oxytocin, you know. You know.
Theobromine is.
The next question, and this can be the last question for tonight because I'm sure this will spark some interesting conversation, comes to us from Michelle Bickersma, who is the secretary of the Victorian Skeptics, the Vic Skeptics in Australia, and she asks. My glasses are fogging up with the hot topic. Oh yes.
can see
My
it.
fault.
What? Oh,
Light.
Let there be light. We're illuminated. What kind of studies should university students do to realistically help save the planet? Where are careers headed, and what kind of graduates are needed? So if we're talking about the recent worldwide movement against global warming and basically saving the planet, if we can use that term. What do you think?
Oh, looking at me.
looking
Well, I
at
mean,
everybody.
obviously STEM fields and problem solving, but you also need a lot of communicators.
Yeah.
You need political science. You need sociologists. I mean, it's kind of everybody. I don't know that you can just pick out one set of fields and say that they're superior. I mean, obviously we need to funnel money into science, but like we said, if we're not figuring out how to get social change,
You need to find
What are we
people who
doing?
are at the interface of politics, social science, and health science,
communicators.
and communication and education. So if you have somebody who can master the interface of these 4 disciplines, then
That's exactly
they
a
would
good
be
point.
extremely useful.
From what we've seen in medicine is that the most progress is done by people that major in two different fields. Like let's say that there is a doctor and an engineer, and then they go into bioprosthetic, you know, and they develop this arm that's like mechanical, and because it needs both, it looks like if people go into one field, it's really hard to make progress further in that field. But if people go into two fields, all of a sudden, you know, they can merge the two fields and make some really great progress.
That's a really interesting thought.
So specializing's not.
Then they
it's
bring the
Specializing is
not
not
such a
always
good
the way
idea.
forward. Yeah,
And communication
Sometimes-
is everything. Like my students think, oh, I'll just be a scientist locked away in a room and I won't ever have to talk to anybody, or I'll be an engineer and never have to speak to anybody. It's like, no, if you can't communicate your ideas, then they're not going anywhere. So like that has to be a vital part. They always complain they have to take speech and writing, and I'm like, that's going to be 40-50% of your jobs, you know. And I think we lose that in like talking about what skills are important.
communication should be an integral part of science.
We should start that at kindergarten too.
But also maybe psychology. You know?
Yeah.
Psychology is super important.
Yeah.
Just to like read each other and read society and
Well,
groups
it's such
of
a
people and
complex,
how we
multi-level
interact.
issue. I suppose
Yeah.
there's no real one area which you could say you should go into this, because there are many areas. Huh?
Yeah.
Well, you know, this kind of prompts my usual lecture on STEM versus STEAM, which is kind of one of my hot buttons. The reason we have STEM initiatives and not STEAM initiatives is because the United States, anyway, I don't know about Australia, but the United States has a strategic shortage of graduates with STEM degrees and a surplus of graduates in arts degrees. Arts being basically lawyers and business majors, but also the humanities and visual and the performing arts. But there's too many graduates with those and not enough jobs for them, where in the STEM fields there's not enough graduates and too many jobs. So that's why they have STEM initiatives. But whenever I make that lecture, people they kind of throw a straw man argument at what I just said. They say, oh, you're saying arts aren't important and people shouldn't study arts.
Right.
No, that's not what we said. And going back to your point, Erika, about how you shouldn't specialize. The STEM initiatives, they just encourage you to, the degree that you graduate with should be a STEM degree, but hopefully you will have had a very broad field of study with all these kinds of diversions into the more artistic areas.
I will say though, as a scientist, art has very much influenced my thinking and my abilities. Like
Absolutely.
I'm a musician, I dance. If I didn't do those things in graduate school, I would have not gotten a PhD in physics, full on. Like if I did not dance and play
Yeah, I
music.
mean,
Like I think it's part
That's
of your
awesome.
brain wiring. Like I'm thankful
Look at the
for that.
greatest scientists in
Look at-
the history of science. I mean,
look at Da Vinci,
a lot of
right? I mean,
them-
Da Vinci
Yeah,
is both
Da
an
Vinci
artist
is a prime
and
example, but even Einstein was an artist too. He played the violin, and
Yes.
I mean, the history is full of great scientists who had a very keen artistic side.
Well, Brian Dunning sings, you know. That's,
Oh, God.
You sing?
Yes.
Oh, right. Sing us some
right? It's open.
The microphone's right.
I refer everyone to Skeptoid episode number 700 if you have any questions on that.
I want to get at your statement though about the stats, because you're right. Fewer people going into STEM fields, but I think it gets more at a lot of this sort of not them not learning to critically think, and then either being completely swayed away from going into science and having that feeling of imposter syndrome, or getting half into it and leaving. That happens all the time. And usually what happens is junior year they don't know how to critically think. They're suddenly asked to, and they leave. Right? They're like, this isn't for me. I'm not smart enough. I'm going. So I wonder, like, there's more systematic issues afoot than So I don't mind the STEAM thing. Art was hugely important in my life, and I'm lucky that I went to a public school where there was a lot of art support, because the ones around me didn't have it. And
But if your degree was in dance, would you be a physics professor right now?
I teach a physics of dancing class.
Do you? Where?
Here.
At COCC?
No, in town. It's the biomechanics of belly
Well,
dance.
okay, we need to talk later because I'm going to that class. I was
truly.
a dance major at one time.
I don't think.
I want to go to this class.
On that question, I don't think I'd have gotten through grad school. I was in a band and I danced a lot, and that was the necessary kind of outlet my brain needed to solve bigger problems. Because problems aren't solved with focus; sometimes they're diffusely solved. And
No, 'cause you're
me
switching gears
doing
and
that
you're not-
that other activity brought about like lots of really beneficial things in my mind, and sanity as well. In grad school, that's more and more important. Yeah, and so I don't know if I'd have gotten a PhD without dancing and playing music.
well,
Sweet. I like that.
Truly.
about 4 years ago, I think, I travelled from Sydney to Canberra to see a lecture, and I don't often do this. And the reason why was because the lecturer was Alan Alda, and he gave a talk about.
I love his voice.
I admire the man immensely. He gave a talk about science and art being long lost lovers.
Oh yeah, they're so intertwined.
Oh yeah.
And he does a podcast now, and he's a great scientific inspiration, Alan Alda. People just think of him as Hawkeye from MASH or some funny movies or whatever, but his passion in life is science. It really is. But science and art is long lost lovers.
Yeah.
Isn't that a wonderful idea?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
I find parallels in teaching them both all the time.
Yeah.
Where they're both solving different kinds of problems in very similar ways by applying some concept to a particular either physical situation or piece of music and trying to develop that into their own unique kind of solution or statement. I love having the two kind of, I don't know, I like that. They're lovers. I've never heard that. Intertwined in their own way. 100%.
It's very poetic.
And then I get excited when you get band nerd day in physics class. I'm like, watch out, everybody. It's my two passions in one place. And then they all just like, wow, you're a weirdo.
And I think that's a wonderful thought to leave our listeners with, that science and art are indeed long lost lovers.
My arm's getting tired.
Sorry.
Just put it up here by the mic.
That's right. Oh, what a pleasant evening this has been in the Oregon snow. There is snow. Look, all around us there's snow. It's
It
fantastic.
didn't all melt today.
And that
Didn't all
big,
melt
beautiful
today.
old tree. Look at that. That is a beautiful tree.
Awesome tree.
It is really,
It's an
really
awesome
pleasant.
tree.
Well, I'd like to thank Jean-Marc. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
I'd certainly like to thank Erika. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
It's my notes, I'm sorry.
My pleasure.
Wendy, thank you indeed.
Of course.
Susan?
Dude, thanks for having me.
Hey, dude, I like that. That's Oregon speaking.
Totally.
Totes.
Lisa Dunning, thank you for participating.
Thank you.
And the light and all, you
And the
know.
light has provided the light for us.
Refills. Yeah.
And the refills, I must say. And Brian Dunning from Skeptoid.com.
Thanks,
Thank
Brian.
you. Yay.
Now sing
Splash light.
Got away with the tail.
Oh, there we go. I just pull a guitar from nowhere.
That's it. So, it'll fade now.
Canberra Skeptics proudly presents a contemporary look at scams in Australia. Thursday, the 13th of February 2020, 6 p.m. to 7:30 p.m. The speaker is Alex Meanley. Now, this will be at the Belconnen Community Service, 26 Chandler Street, Belconnen, ACT, and the cost is free. Scam Watch, run by the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, ACCC, receives around 500 reports of scams from the public every day. Alex Meanley will provide an overview of what scams affected Australians the most in 2019 and are affecting Australians in early 2020, how they work, and how scams can be detected. There will be a Q&A, discussion of some of the strangest scams we've seen reported, and an explanation of the government's latest measures to stop scams. Alex is an assistant director in the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission Scam Watch. Dinner will follow the lecture. To RSVP for the dinner, please email canberraskeptics@gmail.com. That's a contemporary look at scams in Australia, Thursday the 13th of February 2020. And for more information, just follow the links in this week's show notes. So many books to read, so many podcasts to listen to, all those videos online. The Skeptic Zone recommends It's not often I get the time to just listen to other podcasts. I try. I never miss an episode of Skeptoid, but don't tell Brian Dunning that. Sometimes I listen to true crime podcasts. They can be gripping. Books, not so much. As for me, anyway, hearing the words is a better way for me to assimilate information. But just in the last week, I was recommended a podcast from the USA called The Dream. Not much can be gleaned from the title. It could relate to just about anything. This podcast, well, Series 1 anyway, is devoted to MLMs. That's multi-level marketing schemes. You know, the sort of thing sometimes called pyramid schemes. This is where you get in on the ground level of a product, say makeup or some so-called health supplement, and try to sell it. Or, better yet for you and the company, try to get other people, friends, family, anyone at all, to come on board, but under you as you move up the ladder. The first episode of this podcast is entitled Wanna Swim in Cash? Podcast host Jane Marie and her partner Dann Gallucci, together with other producers, take a long, hard look, and sometimes a harrowing look, at the MLM industry in the United States. Of course, the concept is the same all over the world. And how they are, in the end, destined to fail. Fail, that is, for the people roped in on the ground level. But for those calling the shots at the top, it's a different story. Have you ever heard of the aeroplane game? This is where you get invited to a party. Oh, bring lots of money with you. Thousands of dollars, pounds, euros, whatever, and buy a ticket for a plane ride. That goes nowhere. But if you can convince more people to join your flight, you can get promoted to crew level, then take a cut of the money they bring to buy their ticket. Next level up, and you can be a co-pilot, then pilot. The catch? More and more and more people are needed to be recruited to keep the money coming in order for everybody to move up the chain, or pyramid. In the end, there are simply not enough people left to recruit, and that's when the game falls apart, leaving many people, thousands of dollars or whatever, worse off. This game is explained in detail, including an interview with someone who was caught up in it in the podcast. The Dream Series 1 looks at many MLMs going back decades and the real-life effects on some of the family members of Jane Marie. In another episode, one of the producers even signs up to hopefully sell a range of what turns out to be mediocre cosmetics. But as good as Series 1 is, I found Series 2 to be every bit as good and of particular interest to skeptics. For this series takes a look at the wellness industry, vitamins and supplements, and, to be frank, snake oil. Here's a clip from episode 4 of Series 2.
Last episode, we heard from Catherine Price, a science journalist who wrote a book called Vitamania. Catherine's the woman who convinced Dan, former lover of vitamins and supplements, to throw out all of his pills, tinctures, and powders, and rethink the amount of money and energy he was putting into his daily supplement routine. This was for 2 reasons. 1, because he couldn't trust that all the ingredients on the label were actually in the supplement he was taking. And 2, even if the ingredients were what the manufacturers claimed they were, there was almost no chance that studies had been done on each of these products that could explain the efficacy or potential side effects of what he was putting in his body. That lack of information was a result of a series of legislative wins for the supplement industry that left the FDA, the government agency that's supposed to regulate these products, with very little power to do so.
This rang a very loud and familiar bell with me. Just like the USA, Australia too has had laws and regulations regarding so-called alternative medicine and dietary supplements watered down to such a degree that almost anything, no matter how far-fetched, can be marketed or sold as some sort of cure in all but name. Homeopathy is a prime example. In any rigorous system, this absurd travesty would never be allowed to be marketed or sold if any medical claims were made whatsoever. We also learn in this episode of why those peddling supplements in the USA have such clout. Here's a clip featuring Catherine Price, the author of Vitamania.
These dietary supplement industry groups did very smart things. Like they used all the dietary supplement stores in the country, which obviously had a vested interest in being able to sell more products, as basically little outposts where consumers could come in and sign petitions to Congress, fighting back against the supposed things the FDA was doing. They would give discounts if you wrote to Congress members. They would shroud, certain areas of the store in black to supposedly show you what was going to happen if the FDA got its way. My favorite example was this 1993 ad that was put on by a supplement lobbying group that starts with this black screen and this SWAT team jumping out of the back of a van with scary music. They run up the stairs of this mansion, and then they confront this man in his bathrobe. Guns are drawn, and the man turns around, and it turns out that it's Mel Gibson, and he's got a bottle of vitamins in his hand, and he says something essentially that is, it's vitamin C, like in oranges.
Breathe! Hey, guys, it's only vitamins. Vitamin C, like in oranges.
And then the screen cuts to black.
Preying on people's fear of big government, big pharma, the irony is that large multinationals are responsible for many products in the vitamin and supplement game. But getting back to watering down regulations, here's one last clip from this episode that could have been written for Australia.
Another thing that the bill said is that companies are only required to send the FDA information that indicates why they believe the new ingredients will be safe. And they only need to do it 75 days prior to the product going to market. Now it's actually loosened. Now you don't have to send anything. You just have to have it on hand that that you...
Like in your own filing cabinet, you need to have a piece of paper that says...
This is why our product works. This is why we believe our product works. This is from the FDA.
And not a study, just like you saying... I think this works.
Right. I guess it would have to be convincing to the FDA if you had gone to court or something like that, but no one does, so it doesn't matter. This is from the FDA. You are responsible for determining what information provides the basis for your conclusion.
That's terrifying.
Amazing. If you ever visit a pharmacy in Australia, look at the products on sale. They will have printed on them somewhere, normally in small print, either AUST-R, that's AUST-R for regulated, or AUST-L for listed. AUST-L products only need, in theory, to have some sort of evidence of efficacy. In practice, many are not even checked by the TGA, the Therapeutics Goods Administration. This podcast at times gets very personal, at times alarming, but at all times entertaining and educational. From multi-level marketing in Series 1 to the wellness industry in Series 2, the Skeptic Zone recommends The Dream. For more information about this podcast, follow the link in this week's show notes or simply search for The Dream Podcast. With thanks to Michelle Bickersma for recommending it to me.
I'm Mick West. In my podcast, Tales from the Rabbit Hole, I have extended conversations with people who have been involved in conspiracy culture. I do this for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because it's really interesting. These people have great stories about how they fell down the conspiracy theory rabbit hole, what they did down there, and what it was that helped them out. Sometimes I also talk to people who investigate conspiracy theories, and they have equally fascinating stories from the other side. Secondly, I want to understand how best to prevent the spread of conspiracy theories and misinformation, which is an increasing problem in a time when alternative media is exploding. The best way to do this is to communicate effectively with the people involved, and the best way to do that is with a nice long chat. So check it out, Tales from the Rabbit Hole, tftrh.com.
Here's Maynard's spooky action at a distance.
Hello, we've got Jo Benhamu here. Hi, Jo, how are you?
Hi, I'm good. Oh God, he always ambushes me.
I know. Well, look, I was on my way to my lamb. I was about to eat there too. But look, what was it like?
I got the lamb too.
Oh, and what's it like?
Well, I don't know yet because I'm here talking to you.
I know. We're both here. We should be eating. That's what we do for you, the listener. Now, what award you gave was?
I gave the Ben Spoon Award.
Now, what I wanted to know was, were the people that worked on that SBS show the ones that used to work on the ABC show that almost won a Ben Spoon Award?
No. Although we have awarded the Ben Spoon to an ABC show, which was about 15 years ago. Oh, gosh.
Quantum or no? It was
no.
It was a different one.
No. Richard Saunders would know the name of it.
Because there had been some things on Wi-Fi the ABC's done. So was any of the show much use as far as the science show goes?
Look, I have to say, having watched, a fair amount of the show, I don't inherently have a... So in case the listeners aren't aware, would the listeners be aware of the show that we're talking about?
The name of the SBS show that we're talking about that won the Ben Spoon Award is called?
It is Medicine or Myth, which aired this year. It's an 8-part series, and a panel of judges choose amongst a range of home remedies, and then whichever one they think has some potential to be useful for humans or humanity, then is subjected to a trial of some kind.
The one you mentioned, I was thinking, how are they going to get that past the ethics committee? Is a charcoal poultice
for funnel web spider bites,
which is a pretty severe poisonous bite.
Absolutely.
So you'd be testing it on animals or something.
Well, it was actually the person who was promoting this. Funnily enough, is the naturopath Barbara O'Neill, who has recently been banned by the HCCC.
Oh right, okay.
But the claim was that she claimed that her daughter had been bitten by a funnel web spider 6 times, and that
for a start, you've got to stop her playing around the garden when she's doing that.
Well, exactly.
Yeah.
And she claimed that she applied this charcoal poultice to the bite because they didn't have a car and they couldn't get to a hospital and so on, and that her daughter was absolutely fine and had no problems. Now, my scientific mind, when someone makes a claim like that, is to say, well, first of all, was it really a funnel web spider?
Was it 6 times?
Was it 6 times? And various other questions of, what really happened here. But suffice to say, look, some of the things that the people presented were, of course, dubious, but nonetheless, I think that as scientists, our job is to, or scientific-minded people, our job is to actually test these claims. And if something does have plausibility, and some of these things could, I have no problem with them being tested. The reason we awarded the spoon to Medicine or Myth this year, particularly the producers of the show, is that the manner in which the products were tested really did not conform to what a scientist would consider to be a rigorous methodology. So ways that would reduce bias, that would enable us to really know whether the reason people were gaining a benefit from the particular treatment was because the treatment itself was working, or whether it was just placebo. It really was more good TV rather than rigorous science.
So do you think they'll reply to getting the award at all? What do the recipients normally do? They normally snap back, they get snarky on Twitter, what do they do?
It really depends on the recipient. We've had some people who have become very narky and sort of feel very slighted by having been awarded the spoon. Some people wear it as a badge of pride, but generally they tend to go fairly quiet and, just try and let it sail under the radar.
Well, let's talk skeptical fashions here tonight. You're wearing a wonderful, sort of a short evening dress in a sort of a royal blue colour.
It's sort of a royal electric blue.
It's pretty good.
Yeah,
I'm a big fan of it there.
Yeah, thank you.
But what colours are wearing? It is Melbourne, so bright colours aren't normally the go.
No. We have a lot of people in fashionable Melbourne black. We have a few interesting. Suyarachi, Dr. Suyarachi always looks fabulous. She's wearing a lovely green ensemble.
Yes, look at that there.
I know. And I can't really say. We have a lot of pink, actually. I'm seeing a lot of pink shirts.
And
pink seems to be the colour for the men tonight.
Look, I think you find that salmon, and a lot of people have got the idea from what Leonard Nimoy used to wear in the In Search Of series.
Well, that kind of makes a lot of sense that people here would be inspired by Leonard Nimoy.
And look, like I said, Merry Chapmas and a Nimoy New Year, as I like to say. Also, people listen to the In Research Of podcast, where they take an episode of In Search Of from the 70s each week and then actually look into it. It's a great show.
Oh, fabulous. fabulous. I actually don't know it.
Oh, yeah. Did you ever watch the In Search Of show when it got repeated in Australia in the early 90s? Yeah?
No, I don't think so. Which is quite funny because, I had a TV from a very young age and I don't know how I missed that one.
It used to be Sunday afternoons, Channel 7, I think it was. But yeah,
I was watching the Curiosity show.
Oh, yeah. Well, people call it the dawn of paranormal television because Leonard Nimoy and Cameron go, killer bees, earthquakes, plants that can talk.
That sounds like a good B-grade movie.
Well, one of the Plants That Can Talk one was a 70s one, and they wanted to figure out, well, we'll do pain in a person, see if and they got a scalpel and just cut someone's thumb. No alcohol, no nothing, and where the scalpel came from, I don't know. Like something you wouldn't get past an ethics committee.
No ethics committee involved
in that one. And by the way, where are you working at the moment? What are you doing in research still?
So I do two things. I am a senior research nurse at Peter Mac, and I look after lung cancer, bowel cancer, and palliative care trials. And I also teach bioethics to medical students at Monash University.
Right. Now, what's one of your mind games you might play with them when you're teaching them ethics? Like, what is a quandary you might give them and then have a chat to them about later?
The thing about teaching ethics is getting people to understand that there are no right answers, but if you believe really strongly that the way you're going to do something is the right way, you better have a good argument for why you think you can justify it.
Wow.
So if you've got a bit of a trolley problem going on and you think it would be best to, give the kidney to, a particular person or not, you just need to be able to tell us why you think that's right.
Look, just being the devil's advocate here, I'm sure there would have been a couple of Third Reich scientists that could have given you very good explanations as to why they were doing the stuff, using the now discredited science of eugenics, but back then they would have gone, well, science backs me up.
Oh, look, absolutely. And in fact, teaching research ethics and talking about Nazi research is a topic that I really find important to talk to students about. One of the things that is a common problem that we have is whether or not we can actually use research that the Nazis...
That was going to ask you. Get the high altitude research testing that they did in the camps where people actually died.
Yep.
Now, is the science actually usable? Because I remember Carl Krasinski said a lot of it could be junk science. They weren't writing it down properly. But is that stuff useful?
Well, actually, it's actually questionable how useful some of that Nazi research was because, a lot of people have this mindset that, first of all, there's a couple of aspects there. First of all, you kind of got to think, well, can we, even if it was really, really high quality research, ethically, can we use that research? And there is a long-standing ethical debate around whether we are justified in using research that came about because of it's effectively crimes against humanity. And I
once asked George Harab about this, and he came down that at least if it is used, those people that died under horrible circumstances, their lives haven't been wasted. That's what he said about it.
And that is a common argument which I have at times been swayed by, but these days I read an interesting paper by a bioethicist whose name escapes me, but essentially his argument was that there are certain crimes and certain what I guess we could call things that have been done to humanity that meet the category of being so diabolically
Can you use the word abomination or not?
An abomination. That is exactly the word he used. They are such an abomination that in order for that research the use of that research to be justified, the benefit you would get from using that research would have to outweigh the abomination that was done by conducting the research.
Wow. That is an ethical conundrum because then you've got to do the scales and
weighing up, and so often that's what we do in ethics is weighing up benefits and risks and so on. But then the other argument that is made around using this research is people often say, well, the Nazis were so rigorous, they were so ordered and methodological, and they kept such good notes. But in fact, what we have found, well, not me personally, other people who've investigated this, is that in fact the quality of their research was actually not very good. So while many would say, oh, you know, we should utilise this research, firstly, we could never conduct a lot of these experiments today because no ethics committee would ever allow it. But in fact, we really can't rely on that data as being of high enough quality that we could justify using it now. I find it a really fascinating argument, and I think, you know, we always talk about the Nazi research, but in fact, there was research conducted by the Japanese, by the Americans.
In Manchuria, yes.
You know, if we think about the Tuskegee experiments that the Americans performed on African Americans without their knowledge.
And that was properly done science, wasn't it, for its time?
It was actually, the Tuskegee research was actually, you know, yes, it was properly done, but, and if listeners aren't familiar, I highly recommend looking it up. Essentially, the Department of Health, if I recall correctly, in America were interested in looking at the natural course of syphilis infections, and they followed a group of African American men to see how syphilis, essentially the natural course of syphilis in these men.
So they basically didn't treat them and just watched how it went. Yeah?
Well, the thing was, when they were first diagnosed, when they first sort of recruited these men, there wasn't a treatment available at the time. But during the course of conducting the experiment, a treatment for syphilis became available, and these researchers never told the men who were involved, and they didn't offer them a treatment that was now available to them.
You know, I know that Bill Clinton apologised for this. Were there reparations given to them?
I have to say, I'm actually not sure about reparations, but what I do know is that African Americans, because of things like the Tuskegee experiments, and also if you look at the story of Henrietta Lacks and the way her body was used for science without her consent, the African American community quite justifiably have had a long-standing distrust of the medical community and of scientists, which unfortunately, you know, is another factor that plays into why there are poorer health outcomes, because if your community doesn't trust the medical profession, you're going to be less likely to actually seek out medical care. And never mind the fact that medical care in America is horrendously expensive. But I think the research community has a real responsibility to rebuild that trust, particularly, you know, within the Australian community, our Indigenous population that have also been affected by these kinds of abuses of power and of trust. So it's something, as you can hear, it's something I feel very passionate about.
And Jo, just to wind. Sorry.
To wind up.
To wind this up, is there a website where these things are discussed and all the things are mentioned so we can school ourselves about it? Is there one you could recommend to us?
Websites, off the top of my head, I think that I can't think of anything specifically website-wise, but I highly recommend reading The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks by Rebecca Skloot, which is one of the most outstanding representations and
that's all about her cervical or cervical cells.
Yes.
It is cervical?
Cervical. So actually, funnily enough, I was talking to some of the SGU the other day, Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, and we were laughing about the difference between how Americans and Australians pronounce cervical. For me, it's cervical.
Right. Okay. Yes. So it's all about that. So dig into that and have a look, because you'll think going into it, yeah, I know this is what I'm going to think, but then when you read it,
Absolutely. Highly recommend it. It'll also make you realise how much of the medical care that we now benefit from is thanks to Henrietta Lacks and her HeLa cells, which essentially is responsible for much of medical science as we know it today.
Thank you, Jo.
My pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the Skeptic Zone. And thank you to the crowd here in Portland, Oregon. They were so impressed by my talk, I can't tell you. They don't want me to leave the stage. I'll have to do another talk right now, in fact. Be funnier? Somebody said be funnier down here. Well, next week's show, lots more from Maynard at Skepticon 2019 and some other interesting things. But for now, signing off from Portland, Oregon, this is Richard Saunders. And you can tell everybody you're part of a podcast now.
You've been listening to the Skeptic Zone podcast. Please visit our website at www.skepticzone.tv
For show notes, contacts, and to access the back catalogue of episodes going back to 2008. You can follow the Skeptic Zone podcast on Twitter @Skeptic Zone, visit our Facebook page, or leave a review on iTunes. You can also support the Skeptic Zone via Patreon or PayPal. The Skeptic Zone podcast is an independent production. The views and opinions expressed on the Skeptic Zone are not necessarily those of Australian skeptics or any other skeptical organisation. So if you'll indulge me for 1 second, I will do a live introduction to my own podcast. In fact, Brian Dunning and I were thinking about starting a new podcast about drinking beer called Bend the Elbow. I won't put that on the podcast, that's all right.